Hey, what's up, everybody? Happy Tuesday. Hope you guys are having a fantastic day so far. It's Kip here, your whiskey tour guide, and it is time for our Tuesday's Toast to History. Now, here in America, we love to talk about our bourbon. But do you really know where this idea of bourbon came from and why we associate it with our native spirit? Because we're going to talk just a little bit about that. But did you know that bourbon, as we know it today, was not our country's first whiskey that we distilled? Now, we're going to kind of work backwards. So, where did bourbon come from? Now, we're not going to get into some of the details today. That'll be another class. But bourbon, by law, there's some rules, some proofing guidelines for distillation into the barrel, into the bottle. There's can't add any color or flavor to bourbon. There's some various things that it has to be made in America, not Kentucky. It has to be made in America. But the main, and I say main, they're all rules and laws. But the big thing when it comes to bourbon, what defines bourbon from other whiskeys, is the mash bill. Bourbon has to be at least 51% corn or corn dominant. So during the Revolutionary War, we began the migration westward from the East Coast colonies. And we landed in what we would today call Kentucky. Now, at the time, it wasn't Kentucky because Kentucky didn't get her statehood until 1792. This was a portion of Western Virginia, and it was carved out and called Bourbon County. Now, when they migrated, they took that art of distillation that they were familiar with, but what they were used to using wasn't accessible. But what was there was corn. So they began to make corn whiskey. And then, of course, we know the story goes on from there. Kentucky then gets her statehood, but that area becomes the hub of American whiskey. Corn whiskey takes over and becomes the dominant whiskey in our country almost from its inception, very early on. And then by House Concurrent Resolution 57, passed in 1964 on May the 4th, bourbon is declared the native spirit of America. It is ours. It's uniquely and distinctly American. Bourbon is as unique and American as baseball and apple pie, right? We didn't invent whiskey, but bourbon is ours. Now, this isn't bourbon. This is our first whiskey. Now, we go back to the colonists. Those colonists, before we ever got into Western Virginia or Kentucky, when they migrated to the Americas from Ireland and Scotland, a little bit of Germany, a little bit from England herself, when we migrated, they brought the art of distillation that they were familiar with, especially in Ireland and Scotland, where they were familiar with malt. Well, they get to the East Coast, there's not malt. But what is there is rye grain. So they began to distill rye whiskey. And rye whiskey, now again, at this point in time, we have not learned, Elijah Craig hasn't mistakenly charred a barrel and put the whiskey in it and sent it downriver to New Orleans, where we figure out that the use of a charred barrel is going to give us that beautiful red color, because they loved the red liquor when that happened. At this time, it was all unaged whiskey, what we'd kind of call moonshine, but it was unaged, just off the still. They may have done some proofing, obviously, all those things, but an unaged whiskey, like it all was at that point in time. But it was not a corn whiskey, it was rye whiskey. Now, in the world of America today, bourbon is our native spirit. That's what took over. Kentucky's the hub. Even though Kentucky distilleries make rye whiskey, Kentucky is known for bourbon. America is known for bourbon. But it wasn't our first. We used to make rye whiskey, an unaged, high rye whiskey. And that is what our country rallied around early in our inception, from the moment that, well, actually, from the sugar tax that was imposed on the colonists. We did make some rum, we got imported sugar, but when they put a sugar tax, we weren't able to afford the sugar any longer, so they began to use what was there was rye whiskey. And then as we get into the Revolutionary War and this fight for freedom, the colonists, the new country, rally around this spirit, this liquid, this beverage that now has become American. Even though, again, we didn't invent whiskey, but we rallied. And whiskey has played an integral role throughout our entire history. It's not just a footnote, it's not just some blots here and there. It is interwoven into laws and history and wars and just, did I say laws, politics, scandals, all sorts of things. That's why we love talking about whiskey history. But rye whiskey, even though the inferior whiskey in America, meaning a lot of people don't like rye, they say they don't. Everybody just wants bourbon, but bourbon is our native spirit, right? Rye whiskey was actually our first whiskey in this country. Now, what am I sipping on tonight? Well, they weren't around then, but the style. This is a Maryland rye, and I today have the Sagamore Spirit out of right there, I think in Baltimore, Maryland. This is their double oaked, coming in at 96.6 proof. Of course, this is aged rye whiskey. May not be our native spirit, but it was our first. Cheers.